The sky over occupied France was strangely quiet in the late afternoon light, the kind of silence that settles just before something breaks. Inside the cramped cockpit of an American fighter, a young pilot steadied his breath, listening to the low thunder of his engine echo through the metal around him. Sweat mixed with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the distant glint of returning bombers traced a thin, fragile line toward home. He was only 23, 2 months in combat, one confirmed victory. And yet, on that day, he carried the weight of a machine many believed was too heavy, too sluggish, too unforgiving for a knife-edged war in the sky. The aircraft beneath him, massive, powerful, doubted by nearly everyone, had already taken good men and never given them back. But war does not wait for perfection. It demands faith in whatever steel is under your hands. And as the sun dipped lower, that young pilot was about to face a moment no training manual could prepare him for. A moment that would test not only his courage, but the true nature of the most underrated American fighter plane of World War II. The question was simple, brutal, and immediate when everything fell apart. Would this airplane keep him alive? Before that fateful afternoon over France, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt began far from the front lines, in noisy American factories, and on airfields that were never meant to handle a machine of its size. It was an American fighter plane unlike anything the nation had ever built. 10,000 pounds of metal before ammunition or fuel, driven by a massive Pratt& Whitney engine that shook the ground when it roared to life. On paper, it was a powerhouse. In practice, many pilots wondered whether brute strength alone could keep them alive in the unforgiving world of World War II aviation. The first to fly it in combat training were the men of the 56th Fighter Group. They received early production Thunderbolts. In the summer of 1942, machines still rough around the edges, still hiding flaws no manual had fully explained. Their home base at Bridgeport, Connecticut was completely inadequate for such an aircraft. Runways, too short approaches, too tight, and no margin for error. What followed was a season of fear and loss. Engines failed without warning. Control systems locked up. The big fighter behaved nothing like the lighter trainers the pilots knew. 18 young aviators died before they ever saw the enemy. 41 aircraft were destroyed. And each crash left behind a question that no one dared voice aloud. Was this American fighter plane truly ready for war? Yet war offered no alternative. When the Thunderbolt finally reached England in early 1943, the Luftwaffe dominated the airspace over Europe. German fighters, the agile Bf-109 and the ferocious FW-190 could twist, climb, and turn with a predatory grace that the heavier P-47 simply could not match. To counter this, American tacticians wrote a doctrine built on speed and altitude dive in from above fire, in a single decisive burst climb back to safety. No turning fights, no prolonged duels. The Thunderbolt was a weapon of momentum, not maneuver. But doctrine is a fragile thing in the chaos of real combat. Clouds, timing. Sun angles, the unpredictable instincts of enemy pilots. All of it conspired to force young Americans into fights they were never meant to win. The rules of engagement looked clean in the briefing room. Over occupied Europe, they dissolved into instinct and desperation. The men of the 56th Fighter Group knew this better than anyone. They had watched friends vanish into the channel or fall burning over farmland, their thunderbolts twisting toward the earth in ways no theory could explain. Among the officers trying to make sense of this brutal new reality was Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke. Older than most of his men, hardened by years of flying, he carried with him a lesson learned while observing the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain doctrine must bend or men will break. What mattered in the air was not the perfect plan, but the willingness to adapt faster than the enemy. And soon under Zemke's command, the 56th Fighter Group would begin to rethink everything they thought they knew about the P-47 Thunderbolt, because the war was about to prove in blood and steel that its greatest strength had been hiding in plain sight. The turning point arrived on June 26, 1943, high above occupied France. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group stretched across the sky in loose formation, a shield of American fighter planes guarding the wounded B-17s as they limped home from their bombing run near Paris. The air was sharp and thin at 19,000 feet. Sunlight slanted across the cockpit glass in a way that made spotting enemies nearly impossible. And at the very back of the formation, tail end, Charlie flew Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the most vulnerable man in the most vulnerable position. He scanned the sky again and again, searching the empty blue behind him. Nothing. Then everything happened at once. 16 Feldjäger-190s came dropping out of the sun-sleeked German Predators, diving from 25,000 feet with the confidence of hunters who knew the terrain. Before Johnson could finish calling a warning over the radio cannon, shells exploded through his canopy. Plexiglass shattered. Hydraulic fluid burst across his face like scalding rain. A machine gun round tore his oxygen mask away. Another split the skin of his leg. In the space of seconds, the cockpit became a storm of glass, smoke, blood, and fire. The P-47 snapped into an inverted spin. No control, no oxygen. Flames licked at the edges of the cockpit as the massive machine tumbled like a piece of scrap metal hurled from the heavens. Johnson kicked the rudder, braced his boots, tried to slide the canopy back to bail out, but the mechanism was dead, melted, useless. He was trapped in a burning American fighter plane with no way out and nowhere to go but down. Somewhere in the chaos, Johnson stopped fighting. For a brief moment, he simply accepted the quiet truth that every combat pilot knows but rarely faces head on. This might be the end. He thought about Barbara, the life waiting for him across an ocean, the life he would not return to. And then, without warning, the fire went out. Starved of oxygen in the violent spin, the flames collapsed and died. Johnson wiped enough hydraulic fluid from his eyes to see shadows again. He kicked hard left, pulled the stick back, and the P-47's nose clawed upward. By 8,000 feet, the Thunderbolt leveled off. Bleeding, half blind, barely holding together, but alive. He turned toward the English coast, pushing the throttle forward, trusting the big Pratt & Whitney engine to keep running, despite the punishment it had taken. And that was when a single FW-190 eased up alongside him. The German pilot stared at the mangled Thunderbolt, as if puzzled that such a wreck was still in the air. Then he slid behind Johnson and opened fire again. Hundreds of rounds slammed into the P-47's wings, and fuselage a metallic scream echoing through the cockpit. Johnson hunched behind the armored seat, waiting for the moment when something essential engine Spartail would finally give way. It never did. The German made pass after pass, each one a deliberate attempt to finish the job. But the Thunderbolt refused to break. Metal tore, fabric shredded, but the airplane kept flying steady toward England as if powered by something more stubborn than steel. On his final pass out of ammunition, the German pilot formed up beside Johnson one last time. He rocked his wings, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, and turned back toward France. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the American fighter plane, so many had doubted had survived the impossible. When Robert Johnson slid his shattered P-47 Thunderbolt onto the grass at RAF Manston, the silence that followed was almost unreal. Ground crew pried him from the cockpit. His hands still locked around the stick, his legs refusing to move. Only later, when the adrenaline finally bled away, did he learn the scale of what the airplane had endured. 21 cannon strikes, more than 200 machine gun hits, every major surface damaged. Yet the war was rarely so merciful. On that same mission, June 26, 1943, another pilot from the 56th Fighter Group, Lieutenant Roger Dearnever, returned. Dyer had been one of the most naturally gifted aviators of his class, a man who had survived the deadly training period back in Connecticut, survived the near supersonic dive experiment, survived every lesson the P-47 had forced upon young Americans, learning how to fight in a machine built for power, not grace. But on this day in the same sky against the same German attackers, Dear was shot down over France. The difference between survival and death often came down to seconds angles, or the invisible luck that decides whether a shell strikes the engine, the fuel tank, or harmless metal. Johnson's American fighter plane absorbed the damage. Dear's did not. It was a truth every pilot carried with him. You could do everything right and still never make it home. The losses weighed heavily on the 56th Fighter Group. By mid-1943, statistics painted a bleak picture. Young men arrived fresh from training, flew a handful of missions, and disappeared before gaining real combat experience. The official explanations pilot error, improper use of doctrine felt hollow. The men who survived knew combat was far messier than theory. German aces exploited every mistake, every moment of hesitation. And the Thunderbolt, for all its power, required a kind of discipline no manual had fully explained. This was the crucible in which Hubert Zemk made his stand as a commander. Instead of accepting losses as inevitable, he pushed his unit to study, adapt, and evolve. Every mission ended with long, unfiltered discussions. Who succeeded today? Who didn't and why? The answers revealed an uncomfortable truth. The pilots who rigidly followed the hit-and-run doctrine were often the ones getting shot down. They made one pass, climbed away, and left themselves exposed. The pilots who survived and scored kills were those who trusted the P-47 Thunderbolt's raw power enough to stay in the fight, diving and climbing in vertical maneuvers that played to the aircraft's strengths. Little by little, the unit's thinking changed. The Thunderbolt wasn't a delicate duelist. It was a force of momentum. It could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe fielded. It could take damage that would tear a German fighter apart. And it could hammer enemies with 850 caliber guns in the brief windows when a firing solution appeared. As 1943 wore on, the results became impossible to ignore. Kill ratios improved. Veteran German pilots began to note with frustration that Thunderbolt units were fighting differently, more aggressively, more confidently, more unpredictably. The aircraft hadn't changed, the understanding had. And from that understanding came a new truth, one proven in the skies day after day. When flown with energy, teamwork, and tactical imagination, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just survivable, it was deadly. As 1944 unfolded, the air war over Europe changed, and the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt changed with it. The sleek P-51 Mustang, with its long range and elegant lines, took over the deep escort missions into Germany. That shift freed the Thunderbolt for a new purpose, one that would define its legacy more profoundly than any dogfight. The American fighter plane that had once been judged too heavy for aerial duels became the most feared ground attack weapon in the European theater. German troops gave these aircraft a single name: Jabos, fighter bombers, low fast merciless, the same attributes that kept the Thunderbolt alive in air combat: its rugged airframe, its air-cooled radial engine, its sheer structural strength made it devastating against ground targets. Trains vanished in explosions of steam and steel. Truck convoys scattered under the roar of 850 caliber guns. Armored vehicles were cracked open by 5-inch rockets that punched through plate and tore into ammunition stores. A single pass from a Thunderbolt could erase an entire column from the map. For the German army, the consequences were catastrophic. Their logistics depended on daylight rail movement on long supply lines, feeding distant fronts. But by late 1944, any train that moved under the sun risked annihilation. P-47. Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks, and choked the arteries of the Wehrmacht until entire units withered for lack of fuel, ammunition, or food. No grand strategy succeeds when its supplies die on the rails, and the Thunderbolt ensured exactly that. Across the Atlantic, American commanders recognized what this shift meant. The P-47 was no longer merely an aircraft competing with German fighters. It had become a strategic tool, reshaping the battlefield from the ground up. And yet public perception back home rarely mirrored this reality. The Mustang captured headlines and admiration with its polished silhouette and record-setting escort missions. The Thunderbolt, bulky and brutal, did the hard work in silence. But for those who fought the war, the truth was unmistakable. Luftwaffe reports from late 1943 and 1944 reveal growing frustration, not only with American tactics, but with the increasing difficulty of shaking Thunderbolt pilots once they committed to an attack. German replacements were inexperienced, their veteran aces dwindling. Meanwhile, the 56 Fighter Group and others like it refined their methods, building a culture of tactical innovation that outpaced the Luftwaffe's ability to adapt. After the war, many nations, from South America to Europe to the Middle East, purchased surplus Thunderbolts, trusting the same durability that had saved so many American pilots. The aircraft's design philosophy echoed into the jet age through machines like the F-84, F-105, F-4 Phantom. Even the A-10 Warthog, big, tough, heavily armed, built not for elegance but for survival and firepower. In the eyes of the world, that was the true legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. A reminder that power, resilience, and the will to adapt can change the course of a war. In the years after the war, Robert Johnson rarely spoke about June 26, 1943. He lived a quiet life, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, worked an ordinary job in an ordinary town. To those around him, he was a husband, a father, a neighbor. Only a few understood that he had once ridden a crippled American fighter plane through fire and steel and brought it home when no aircraft should have survived. His story remained etched not in grand speeches, but in the silence of a man who carried memory with the humility of someone who had seen too much. That silence mirrored the fate of the P-47 Thunderbolt itself. History remembered the sleek lines of the Mustang, the glamour of long-range escort missions, the photographs that looked good in newspapers. But the most underrated American combat plane of World War II left its mark in ways less visible and far more enduring. It survived hits no other fighter could survive. It tore apart German logistics. It carried its pilots home again and again when luck and physics said it should not. And it proved beyond statistics or legend that raw strength, paired with the right tactics, could rewrite the rules of air combat. The 56th Fighter Group understood this better than anyone. They discovered that mastery comes not from having the perfect machine, but from understanding the one you have, its limited strengths, its hidden gifts, and using them with discipline, bravery, and imagination. Their pilots trusted the Thunderbolt not because it was beautiful, but because it was faithful. And where faithfulness can matter more than elegance. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson the P-47 leaves behind. Wars are not won by flawless technology or heroic myth alone. They are won by people who adapt faster than the enemy, who learn from failure, who take imperfect tools and turn them into decisive instruments. They are won by leaders who listen, by crews who keep engines alive through the night, by pilots who climb into battered cockpits knowing the odds and flying anyway. So the question now passes to us: what truly made the P-47 Thunderbolt great, the machine itself or the people who refused to quit on it? If stories like this speak to you, if they remind you of the courage and cost behind every page of history, consider joining us. Like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Every voice in this community helps keep these stories alive, because history only fades when we allow it to be forgotten. The battle may be over, but the legacy of the Thunderbolt, the most faithful of America's wartime fighters, still echoes in the sky.